At 4:17 a.m. on May 13, 1862, the Confederate gunship CSS Planter approached Fort Sumter with its massive cannons aimed directly at the wheelhouse where Robert Smalls stood. 23 years old, dressed in the captain's stolen uniform and straw hat, Smalls raised his hand to pull the steam whistle cord that would signal the fort's garrison. His wife Hannah and their 3 children huddled below deck with 7 other families, their lives depending on the next 30 seconds. One wrong whistle blast, one nervous gesture, one moment of hesitation, and the fort's artillery would reduce the Planter to splinters before any of them could draw another breath. This was Fort Sumter, the place where the Civil War had exploded into existence just 13 months earlier. The Confederacy's most symbolic fortress, manned by battle-hardened soldiers who had orders to sink any vessel that failed to give the correct recognition signal. Smalls had watched Captain Relay perform this ritual hundreds of times during his years as the ship's enslaved pilot, memorizing every detail with the desperate focus of a man who knew his life would someday depend on perfect imitation. But memorization and execution were different creatures entirely when Confederate riflemen tracked your every movement through their gun sights. The fort's signal lantern flashed twice. Respond incorrectly, and the game ended. Smalls' hand trembled as it gripped the whistle cord. Behind him in the engine room, his co-conspirator Alfred Gradine fed coal into the boiler while simultaneously trying to quiet a crying infant whose mother pressed the child against her chest with mounting terror. On deck, crew members Samuel Smith and Abraham Alston maintained their positions with forced casualness, knowing that any unusual movement would trigger scrutiny from the fort's observers, who studied every passing vessel for signs of treachery or Union infiltration. Smalls pulled the cord. The steam whistle shrieked its response across the dark water. 2 long blasts, 1 short, 1 long. The recognition signal Captain Relay had used every night for the past 6 months, the signal that announced a Confederate vessel on legitimate business, commanded by a white officer whose authority was beyond question. The signal that would either deliver them to freedom or expose them as escaped slaves, committing the most audacious theft in American military history. Seconds stretched into eternities. The fort's searchlight swept across the Planter's deck, illuminating Smalls in his stolen uniform as he stood with manufactured confidence in the wheelhouse, his arms crossed in the exact posture Captain Relay adopted whenever approaching a checkpoint. The oversized straw hat shadowed his face in the pre-dawn darkness, but would it be enough to hide his black features from observers who might look too closely? Would the uniform's authority override any suspicions about the man wearing it? The searchlight lingered. Fort Sumter's sentinel studied the vessel. Then, with agonizing slowness, the light moved on. A signal lantern flashed green. Permission to pass. The most fortified checkpoint in the Confederacy had just waved through a ship full of escaping slaves, led by a man who had been property less than 4 hours ago. But Smalls knew the real test still lay ahead. Fort Moultrie waited 3 miles beyond, followed by the Union blockade that might blow them out of the water before recognizing their surrender. They had crossed the first threshold, but death still surrounded them on all sides. This is not fiction. What you just heard is documented in historical records, verified by multiple primary sources. Unlike storytelling channels that fabricate tales, every detail in this video comes from authenticated narratives, court documents, and eyewitness testimonies preserved in historical archives. Before we continue, hit that subscribe button, because real history is more incredible than any fiction could ever be. Now, let me take you back to where this nightmare began. Robert Smalls was born into slavery on April 5, 1839, in Beaufort, South Carolina, a coastal town where the saltwater marshes bred mosquitoes and wealth in equal measure. His mother Lydia served in the household of Henry McKee, a planter whose wealth rested on the labor of 110 human beings he claimed as property. From his earliest memories, Robert understood that his body belonged to someone else, that his future had been decided before his first breath, and that the system sustaining this injustice possessed the full authority of law, custom, and overwhelming violence. But Lydia Smalls possessed a fierce intelligence that she passed to her son, along with something more dangerous: the belief that slavery's power was neither natural nor inevitable. She taught Robert to read despite laws forbidding slave literacy, using torn pages from McKee's discarded newspapers and the family Bible to build her son's understanding of a world beyond Beaufort's plantation boundaries. More crucially, she taught him to observe the white world with calculating attention, to memorize the patterns of power and authority that governed how masters moved through their domain, to study the mechanisms of control until he understood them well enough to potentially exploit their weaknesses. When Robert turned 12, Lydia made a request that would alter the trajectory of his life. She asked McKee to hire her son and out to work in Charleston, South Carolina's busiest port city, where he might learn skills beyond field labor's brutal simplicity. Her stated reason emphasized the additional income Robert could generate for his master through specialized employment. Her actual motivation was far more subversive. She wanted her son exposed to Charleston's complex, urban environment, where free black communities, white institutions, and the machinery of commerce created opportunities that plantation life could never offer. McKee agreed, and in 1851, 12-year-old Robert Smalls arrived in Charleston, carrying a single change of clothes and a burning curiosity about the world beyond Beaufort's marshlands. The city overwhelmed his senses with its contradictions. Here, enslaved people worked alongside free blacks and white laborers in a complex economy that demanded specialized skills rather than mindless fieldwork. Here, ships from around the world docked at wharves where cotton, rice, and human beings were traded as interchangeable commodities. Here, the machinery of slavery operated with industrial efficiency, while simultaneously revealing its fundamental instability. Robert's first employment was as a lamplighter, maintaining the gas lamps that illuminated Charleston's streets after dark. The work taught him the city's geography, its rhythms, its hidden spaces. But more importantly, it taught him that enslaved people could move through white Charleston with relative invisibility if they performed their assigned roles with convincing deference. The white residents barely noticed the black boy who lit their lamps each evening, never suspecting that he observed and cataloged every detail of their world with methodical intensity. At 15, Robert transitioned to working Charleston's waterfront, initially as a stevedore loading cotton bales and rice barrels onto ships bound for northern and European markets. The labor was brutal, 12-hour days of physical exertion that left his muscles screaming and his hands raw with blisters that hardened into calluses. But waterfront work offered something plantations never could: technical knowledge about ships, navigation, cargo handling, and most crucially, the complex maritime systems that governed how vessels moved through Charleston Harbor's treacherous waters. Charleston Harbor was no ordinary port. Its entrance channel threaded between shifting sandbars and submerged obstacles that could tear open a ship's hull with casual violence. Multiple forts guarded the approaches, their cannons capable of sinking any vessel that failed to navigate the authorized channels or provide correct recognition signals. The harbor's pilots, men who specialized in guiding ships through these dangers, commanded respect and substantial compensation for their irreplaceable knowledge. Robert watched these pilots work with obsessive attention, memorizing their movements, their hand signals to helmsmen, their calculations of tide and current, their knowledge of which channels offered safe passage and which promised destruction. When a waterfront supervisor recognized Robert's intelligence and aptitude for maritime work, he recommended the young man for training as a ship's hand aboard coastal vessels. This recommendation, motivated purely by the supervisor's desire to maximize the value of McKee's property through skilled employment, accidentally opened a door to Robert's future. Ship work exposed him to navigation, seamanship, weather prediction, mechanical operations, and most importantly, the social dynamics that governed life aboard vessels, where enslaved crew members often worked with greater autonomy than plantation field hands could ever imagine. By age 18, Robert Smalls had become one of Charleston Harbor's most skilled pilots, capable of navigating the port's dangerous waters with a confidence that ship captains, both commercial and military, found invaluable. His enslaved status meant he could never hold an official pilot's license, but the reality of maritime economics overrode legal restrictions when competent pilots were scarce and harbor navigation was genuinely dangerous work. Ship owners paid premium rates to hire Robert's services, with the majority of these earnings flowing to Henry McKee, while Robert received small allowances that he saved with miserly determination. During these years of maritime employment, Robert met Hannah Jones, a 17-year-old enslaved woman who worked as a hotel maid in Charleston. Their courtship followed the complicated patterns of enslaved romance, where love flourished despite the constant awareness that their relationship existed at their master's pleasure and could be terminated through sale or separation at any moment. When they married in 1858, Robert spent his entire savings, over $700 accumulated through years of waterfront labor, attempting to purchase Hannah's freedom and that of their infant daughter Elizabeth. The attempt failed. Hannah's owner rejected Robert's offer, making clear that Hannah's value as property exceeded any price an enslaved man could reasonably accumulate. This rejection crystallized Robert's understanding that the system would never voluntarily release him or his family. No amount of hard work, savings, or good behavior would secure their freedom through legitimate channels. The only path to liberty required breaking the law in ways that would result in execution if he failed. It was a calculation that Robert returned to repeatedly during his early 20s, weighing the possibility of freedom against the certainty of death if his escape attempt was discovered. The outbreak of civil war in April 1861 transformed Charleston from a bustling commercial port into the Confederacy's most vital military harbor. Fort Sumter, the federal installation guarding the harbor entrance, became the war's first battlefield when Confederate artillery bombarded it into submission after a 34-hour siege. The same harbor channels that Robert navigated for commercial shipping now served military purposes as Confederate forces fortified Charleston's defenses against expected Union attacks. The Confederate Navy seized or commissioned civilian vessels for military service, converting Charleston's merchant fleet into a makeshift naval force tasked with defending the harbor and conducting operations against Union blockade ships. In October 1861, the Confederate military commandeered the Planter, a 137-foot sidewheel steamer that had previously served as a civilian cotton transport. The military conversion equipped the vessel with 4 cannons and designated it as a dispatch and transport ship responsible for moving troops, ammunition, and supplies between Charleston's various fortifications. More ominously, the Planter was assigned to lay underwater mines in Charleston Harbor's channels, creating barriers that would sink Union ships attempting to force their way into the port. Robert Smalls Recognized as one of Charleston Harbor's most skilled pilots despite his enslaved status, was pressed into service aboard the Planter under its captain, Charles Relier, a white Confederate officer who depended entirely on Robert's navigation expertise to safely maneuver through the mine-filled waters that Robert himself had helped lay. This arrangement created a bitter irony. Robert possessed knowledge that was essential to Confederate military operations, while simultaneously being property without legal rights or human recognition. Captain Relier trusted Robert's seamanship enough to stake his life on it during dangerous navigation, but would never acknowledge Robert as anything more than particularly valuable equipment. The Planter's enslaved crew consisted of 8 men: Robert Smalls, Alfred Gradine, Abraham Alston, Samuel Smith, Gabriel Turno, William Morrison, John Smalls, and David Jones. Some were experienced sailors, others pressed into service from Charleston's waterfront. What united them was their enslaved status and their collective understanding that the Confederacy fighting to preserve slavery would never willingly grant them freedom, regardless of their service's value. As the war progressed and Confederate defeats mounted, these eight men began having careful, coded conversations during their off-duty hours, discussing possibilities that could only be voiced in fragments and hints until trust was absolutely established. Robert emerged as the natural leader of these discussions, not through aggressive assertion, but through quiet demonstration that he possessed both the knowledge and the temperament required to attempt something as audacious as stealing a Confederate warship. He knew Charleston Harbor's channels with the intimacy of a man who had navigated them hundreds of times. He knew the location and patrol patterns of every Confederate fort. He knew the recognition signals that ships used to identify themselves to sentries. He knew the Union blockade's approximate position 3 miles beyond the harbor mouth. And he knew that attempting escape would result in execution for everyone involved if any element of the plan failed. The planning required months of meticulous observation and careful preparation. Robert studied Captain Relier's habits with obsessive attention, noting when the captain went ashore, how long he typically remained away from the ship, what factors might cause him to deviate from established routines. He memorized the exact sequence of whistle signals used to identify the Planter to each fort. He calculated tide tables and current flows to identify the optimal departure time that would maximize their speed while minimizing visibility during pre-dawn darkness. He identified which crew members could be trusted with knowledge of the escape plan and which might betray them through fear or misplaced loyalty. Most crucially, Robert began studying Captain Relier's physical mannerisms with the attention of a man whose life would depend on convincing impersonation. How Relier stood in the wheelhouse, how he crossed his arms when waiting for signal responses, how he wore his distinctive straw hat pulled low over his forehead, how he moved with the casual authority of a man whose right to command was never questioned. Robert practiced these gestures in private, training his body to adopt the posture of white authority until the performance became second nature. By early May 1862, the plan had crystallized into executable form. The crew had agreed to risk everything. Robert had secured permission to bring his wife, children, and mother aboard the Planter, under the pretext that they would travel to another part of Charleston to visit relatives, a common enough occurrence that it raised no suspicions. The tide tables indicated that May 13th would offer optimal conditions for a midnight departure. All that remained was waiting for the moment when Captain Relier and the other Confederate officers left the ship overnight, which happened occasionally when military business or personal recreation drew them away from their vessel. On the evening of May 12, 1862, Captain Relea informed Robert that he and the other white officers would be spending the night ashore attending a social function. They would return to the Planter at dawn on May 13th to begin the day's operations. This was the opportunity. Once the officers departed around 8 p.m., Robert had perhaps 10 hours to execute a plan that required multiple elements to align perfectly. Failure at any stage, escape from the dock, passage through the harbor, navigation past 5 Confederate forts, surrender to the Union blockade, would result in death for everyone involved. Robert sent word to his wife Hannah, his mother Lydia, and the families of other crew members to board the Planter immediately. They arrived in small groups to avoid attracting attention, carrying only the possessions they could hide under their clothing. Hannah brought their 3 children, Elizabeth, age 7, Robert Jr., age 4, and baby Sarah, not yet 2 years old. 7 other families joined them, 16 people total, including infants whose inability to remain silent posed perhaps the greatest danger to the entire enterprise. At 3 a.m. on May 13th, with Confederate officers still ashore and Charleston sleeping under a moonless sky, Robert Smalls put on Captain Relea's jacket and distinctive straw hat. The uniform fit poorly. Robert was shorter and more powerfully built than the captain. But in darkness and at distance, the costume might create sufficient illusion to pass inspection from Confederate sentries, who expected to see their captain commanding the Planter. The straw hat was crucial because it shadowed Robert's face, hiding his African features behind the authority that white supremacy invested in the uniform itself. Robert gathered the crew for final instructions. They would maintain absolute silence, except for necessary navigation commands. Women and children would remain below deck throughout the escape, keeping infants and small children quiet through whatever means necessary. If they were discovered or stopped before reaching the Union blockade, they would not surrender. Robert made clear that capture meant execution and possible re-enslavement for the women and children, outcomes worse than dying in the escape attempt. Every crew member understood the stakes and accepted them. At 3:15 a.m., Robert gave the order to light the boiler fires. The Planter's steam engine required 20 minutes to build sufficient pressure for movement. During this vulnerable window, anyone noticing unusual smoke or activity from the vessel might investigate and discover the escape in progress. But Charleston's waterfront at 3 a.m. was quiet, with only scattered sentries who paid little attention to routine military vessel activities that occurred at all hours during wartime. At 3:35 a.m., with steam pressure adequate for navigation, Robert ordered the mooring lines released. The Planter backed away from its Charleston dock and began moving down the Cooper River toward Charleston Harbor proper. The first test had passed. They had escaped the immediate dock area without triggering alarm. But the real challenges lay ahead in the 5 miles of harbor navigation that would take them past multiple Confederate installations before reaching the harbor entrance where Fort Sumter waited. The first checkpoint was the southern wharf, where another Confederate vessel, the guard ship Etowah, was moored. The Etowah's duty was to monitor all shipping traffic and challenge any vessel displaying suspicious activity. As the Planter approached, Robert maintained steady speed and gave no unusual signals. The Etowah's watch officer observed their passage, but seeing the familiar vessel commanded by what appeared to be Captain Relea in his distinctive straw hat, waved them through without challenge. Robert's impersonation had passed its first real test against someone who knew Captain Relea by sight. The next obstacle was Castle Pinckney, a fort on Schuet's Folly Island that guarded the inner harbor. The fort's artillery could sink the Planter with a single broadside, and its sentries were specifically instructed to challenge all vessels moving through the harbor during nighttime hours. As they approached, Robert reduced speed and sounded the required whistle signal. 2 short blasts, followed by 1 long blast. The fort's signal officer responded with a lantern flash, indicating permission to proceed. Robert had correctly replicated the recognition signal that Confederate vessels used to identify themselves as friendlies rather than threats. But Robert knew the most dangerous checkpoints still lay ahead. Fort Ripley, positioned to cover the harbor's middle channel, had recently increased its security protocols after Confederate commanders expressed concern about potential Union infiltration attempts. As the Planter approached Fort Ripley around 4 a.m., Robert could see increased lantern activity on the fort's walls, suggesting heightened alert status. He gave the whistle signal with forced steadiness, despite the sweat running down his back beneath Captain Reliea's jacket. Fort Ripley's signal officer responded with an unexpected query, a different whistle pattern that Robert didn't immediately recognize. For a moment that stretched toward eternity, Robert froze at the wheel, his mind racing through every signal pattern he had memorized during months of observation. The fort was asking for additional identification. If he responded incorrectly, the fort's cannons would open fire immediately. If he didn't respond at all, they would interpret silence as hostile intent. Then Robert realized they were asking for the Planter's specific identification code, a signal he had heard Captain Relia use only 3 times in the past month, when Fort Ripley had implemented new security protocols. Robert's hand moved to the whistle cord and pulled the pattern from memory. 3 short blasts. Pause. 2 long blasts. The code that identified the Planter specifically, rather than just any Confederate vessel. The wait for Fort Ripley's response felt like drowning. Below deck, Hannah pressed baby Sarah against her chest, the infant's breathing the only sound in the cramped space where 16 people held absolute stillness. In the engine room, Alfred Gradine kept his hand on the throttle, ready to attempt full-speed evasion if the fort opened fire, though he knew escape was impossible if the batteries targeted them at this range. Fort Ripley's signal lantern flashed green. Permission granted. They were past the 3rd checkpoint, but Robert's hands trembled so violently he had to clench the wheel to maintain steady course. 2 more forts waited ahead, Fort Johnson and Fort Sumter, each more dangerous than the last. Fort Johnson guarded the harbor's southern channel, its cannons positioned to create crossfire with Fort Sumter that could reduce any unauthorized vessel to splinters within minutes. As the Planter approached, Robert noticed increased activity on Fort Johnson's ramparts. Soldiers moved with purpose that suggested heightened alert. Had someone at the earlier forts become suspicious and sent warning? Had the Planter's absence from its dock been noticed? Robert had no way to know, and no choice but to proceed. He gave the required whistle signal and maintained steady course while Fort Johnson's searchlight swept across the Planter's deck. The light caught Robert standing in the wheelhouse, his face shadowed by Captain Reliea's straw hat, his posture deliberately matching the captain's characteristic stance with arms crossed and weight slightly forward, as if eagerly anticipating the day's work ahead. The searchlight held him in its glare for 5 seconds that felt like hours. Then it moved on, and Fort Johnson's signal officer flashed permission to proceed. 4 checkpoints passed. Only Fort Sumter remained. But Fort Sumter was not simply another checkpoint. It was the Confederacy's most symbolic fortress, the place where Confederate artillery had fired the war's opening shots 13 months earlier. Fort Sumter was manned by the Confederacy's most experienced garrison, commanded by officers who would never forgive themselves if they allowed a stolen Confederate warship to escape through their blockade. Fort Sumter's cannons covered every approach angle, and its standing orders were to sink any vessel that failed to provide correct recognition or displayed suspicious behavior. As the Planter approached Fort Sumter at 4:17 a.m., Robert could see the fortress's distinctive silhouette against the lightening eastern sky. Dawn was approaching faster than planned. The darkness that concealed Robert's features was giving way to morning light that would make his racial identity obvious to anyone who looked carefully. If Fort Sumter's inspection took too long, if they decided to board the Planter for verification, if any element of Robert's impersonation failed under close scrutiny, the entire escape would collapse into violence and death. Robert pulled the whistle cord for the recognition signal. 2 long blasts, 1 short, 1 long. The pattern Captain Relier had used every time the Planter passed Fort Sumter during Robert's months of observation. The signal that announced a Confederate vessel on legitimate military business, commanded by a white officer whose authority was unquestionable. Fort Sumter's searchlight blazed to life, sweeping across the Planter's deck with methodical thoroughness. The light found Robert in the wheelhouse, illuminated him in his stolen uniform and hat, held him in its glare while the fort's duty officer studied the vessel. Robert forced himself to maintain Captain Relier's posture, despite every instinct screaming at him to run, hide, acknowledge the impossibility of this disguise holding under direct examination. Below deck, Hannah clutched their children with desperate strength, while other mothers pressed hands over their babies' mouths to prevent any sound that might trigger suspicion. The searchlight swept the deck, checking for other crew members, looking for anything unusual or unexpected. It lingered on the wheelhouse one final time. Then, with agonizing deliberation, Fort Sumter's signal officer flashed green. Permission to pass. The Confederacy's most vital fortress had just authorized passage for a vessel full of escaping slaves, commanded by a man who had been property when the night began. But Robert knew they were not yet safe. Beyond Fort Sumter lay 3 miles of open water patrolled by the Union blockade, Northern warships that would fire on any approaching Confederate vessel before asking questions. The Planter was a Confederate military ship, recognizable as an enemy target to Union gunners who had standing orders to sink any Southern vessels attempting to run their blockade. Robert had to somehow signal surrender before Union cannons reduced them to wreckage, and he had to do it quickly because every minute of approaching daylight made the Planter more visible to Confederate observers who might notice something wrong and send pursuit vessels. As soon as Fort Sumter fell behind them, Robert ordered full steam ahead. The Planter surged forward with every pound of pressure its boiler could generate, racing toward the Union blockade at speeds that would have been reckless under normal circumstances, but were essential now. Behind them, Charleston Harbor slowly came to life as the Confederate garrison began its morning routines. How long before someone noticed the Planter's unauthorized absence? How long before pursuit ships were dispatched? How long before Confederate artillery realized a Union surrender was occurring and opened fire to prevent it? At 4:45 a.m., with dawn breaking across the Atlantic, Robert spotted the Union blockade, a line of Northern warships positioned 3 miles offshore to intercept any Confederate vessels attempting to break free or supply ships trying to reach Charleston. The nearest vessel was the USS Onward, a gunboat whose cannons were already trained on the approaching Planter. Robert could see activity on the Union ship's deck as sailors ran to battle stations, preparing to fire on what they correctly identified as a Confederate military vessel approaching at aggressive speed. Robert had prepared for this moment as carefully as every other element of the escape. He ordered crew members to haul down the Confederate flag that identified the Planter as a Southern military vessel. In its place, they raised a white bedsheet, an improvised flag of surrender that Robert prayed the Union gunners would recognize before opening fire. But the white sheet was difficult to see against the Planter's white-painted wheelhouse in the dim morning light. and the USS Onward showed no sign of lowering its gun barrels that tracked the approaching Confederate ship with deadly intent. "Wave it!" Robert shouted to Abraham Alston, who climbed onto the wheelhouse roof and waved the white sheet with violent motion that might catch Union attention before their gunners fired. "Wave it like your life depends on it, because it does." On the USS Onward's deck, Captain John Frederick Nichols watched the approaching Confederate vessel through his spyglass, his finger poised to give the fire order. The enemy ship was approaching rapidly on an intercept course that suggested either attack or desperation. Then Nichols' spyglass caught movement on the Confederate vessel's wheelhouse, a man waving white fabric with frantic energy that spoke of surrender rather than aggression. "Hold fire," Nichols ordered. "Prepare boarding party. That ship appears to be surrendering, but maintain guns trained in case it's a ruse." As the Planter pulled alongside the USS Onward, Robert Smalls stepped out of the wheelhouse into full sunlight, removing Captain Reliea's straw hat to reveal his face clearly to the Union sailors, who stared in stunned silence. "Good morning, sir," Robert called up to Captain Nichols in a voice that carried across the water with calm authority, despite the terror and exhaustion that churned beneath his composed exterior. "I have brought you some of the old United States guns, sir, these 4 cannons you see on deck, and I hope you'll not refuse them. I thought you might find them useful." Nichols' astonishment was visible even from the Planter's deck. "Who the hell are you, and how did you get that ship?" "I'm Robert Smalls, sir. I'm a slave, or I was a slave until about an hour ago. These are my crew members, all slaves, and we've just stolen this Confederate gunship from Charleston Harbor. My wife and children are below, along with the families of my crew. We surrender ourselves to the United States Navy and request protection under Union authority." As Union sailors boarded the Planter to verify Robert's incredible claim, the full scope of what he had accomplished became clear. He had delivered not just a Confederate warship, but detailed intelligence about Charleston Harbor's defenses, including a code book containing all current recognition signals for Confederate vessels, maps showing the precise locations of underwater mines that Robert had helped lay, and crucial information about troop dispositions throughout Charleston's fortifications. The military value of this intelligence was immeasurable. It would enable Union forces to navigate Charleston Harbor's defenses with confidence, potentially opening the door for Union capture of the Confederacy's most vital Atlantic port. News of Robert Smalls' escape reached Charleston around 6 a.m., when the Confederate garrison finally realized that the Planter was not conducting authorized morning operations, but had instead been stolen by its enslaved crew. The response was immediate fury and disbelief. Captain Reliea faced court-martial proceedings for his negligence in leaving the vessel under slave supervision overnight. Confederate authorities offered substantial rewards for Robert's recapture, describing him in wanted posters as a dangerous fugitive who had committed theft of military property. The Charleston Mercury newspaper, expressing the city's white establishment's outrage, declared that Robert Smalls had perpetrated one of the most daring and heroic adventures of the war, a backhanded compliment that acknowledged his achievement's audacity even while condemning his defiance of the racial order that had enslaved him. For Robert, the escape marked the beginning of a new life that would exceed anything he had dared imagine during his years as Charleston's enslaved harbor pilot. The Union Navy immediately recognized the value of Robert's navigation expertise and local knowledge. Within weeks of his escape, he was employed as a pilot for Union vessels operating in southern waters, using his intimate knowledge of Confederate harbors to guide northern ships through dangerous channels while avoiding mines and shore batteries. His compensation, substantial wages that went to him rather than a master, enabled Robert to support his extended family while saving money with the same discipline he had demonstrated during his enslaved years. But Robert's ambitions extended beyond personal security and financial stability. The Union Navy's desperate need for experienced pilots, combined with the increasing acceptance of black military service as the war progressed, created opportunities that had been unthinkable before 1861. In October 1862, just 5 months after his escape, Robert was formally appointed as pilot aboard the USS Crusader, a Union gunboat conducting operations along the South Carolina coast. This appointment made Robert one of the first black pilots to serve in the United States Navy, a position of genuine authority that demonstrated how military necessity could temporarily override the racial barriers that had previously seemed immutable. Robert's service aboard Union vessels during 1862-1863 was characterized by exceptional competence and remarkable courage under fire. He participated in 17 military engagements, navigating Union ships through hostile waters, while Confederate shore batteries fired on them with artillery that could have reduced any vessel to burning wreckage. His knowledge of Southern coastal defenses proved invaluable, enabling Union commanders to conduct successful operations that would have been impossible without local expertise. On multiple occasions, Robert's navigation skill prevented Union ships from running aground or striking underwater obstacles that would have destroyed them. The most dramatic moment of Robert's Civil War service occurred in December 1863, when he was serving as pilot aboard the USS Planter, the same vessel he had stolen 18 months earlier, now commissioned into Union service. During a military operation near Charleston, the Planter came under heavy fire from Confederate artillery. The vessel's white captain panicked under the bombardment, abandoning his post and hiding below deck rather than maintaining command during the emergency. Robert, without hesitation or formal authority, took control of the vessel and navigated it out of the Confederate artillery's range, saving the ship and everyone aboard from destruction. This act of battlefield leadership would have resulted in commendation for any white officer. For a black pilot who had been enslaved 2 years earlier, it should have been unthinkable. But the Union Navy, desperate for capable leadership and increasingly willing to recognize competence regardless of race, responded to Robert's action with unprecedented recognition. In 1864, he was promoted to captain of the USS Planter, becoming the first black man to command a United States military vessel. The symbolism was profound. A man who had stolen a Confederate ship while enslaved was now officially commanding that same vessel under United States authority, directing combat operations against the government that had claimed him as property. Robert's wartime service continued through 1865, by which time he had become one of the Union Navy's most experienced pilots and a recognized military leader whose expertise and courage had been tested repeatedly under combat conditions. When the Civil War ended in April 1865 with Confederate surrender, Robert Smalls had established himself as far more than an escaped slave who had performed a single audacious act. He had demonstrated leadership, strategic thinking, and sustained competence under pressure, qualities that would serve him well in the challenges ahead. The post-war era presented Robert with opportunities that would have been impossible under slavery, but remained deeply constrained by the racial prejudice that persisted despite the Confederacy's defeat. South Carolina, like other Southern states, faced the enormous challenge of Reconstruction. The process of rebuilding society after slavery's destruction, while determining what legal and political status formerly enslaved people would hold in the new order. The questions were fundamental. Would Black Americans receive citizenship, voting rights, equal protection under law? Or would white Southerners succeed in recreating slavery's racial hierarchy through new legal mechanisms that preserved white supremacy while technically complying with the 13th Amendment's abolition of formal slavery. Robert Smalls recognized that the struggle for black freedom was far from over despite slavery's formal end. The legal right to own one's body meant little if black Americans could not vote, hold political office, own property, or receive equal treatment under law. The battle that mattered now was political rather than military, fought through legislation and community organizing rather than naval combat. And Robert, with his reputation as a war hero and his demonstrated leadership capabilities, was uniquely positioned to fight this battle. In 1868, South Carolina held a constitutional convention to draft a new state constitution under Reconstruction guidelines that required formerly Confederate states to grant black men full citizenship and voting rights as conditions for readmission to the Union. Robert Smalls, just 29 years old, was elected as a delegate to this convention, representing the Beaufort district where he had been born into slavery. At the convention, he advocated forcefully for public education, equal rights under law, and economic policies that would enable formerly enslaved people to acquire land and build economic independence. His contributions to the convention's debates demonstrated sophisticated understanding of constitutional law and political economy that belied any racist assumptions about black intellectual capacity. The 1868 Constitution that emerged from this convention was one of the most progressive governing documents in American history up to that point, establishing public education, protecting civil rights, and creating the framework for interracial democracy that Reconstruction represented at its most optimistic. Robert's role in crafting this Constitution marked his emergence as a significant political leader whose influence would extend far beyond his individual district. In 1870, Robert Smalls was elected to the South Carolina House of Representatives, beginning a political career that would span 3 decades and include service in both the state legislature and the United States Congress. His election represented the remarkable transformation that Reconstruction made possible. A man who had been property in 1862 was now helping to write laws in 1870, exercising political authority over the same society that had enslaved him. Robert's political career focused consistently on issues that would improve black Americans' economic and educational opportunities. He advocated for public education funding, understanding that literacy and knowledge were essential foundations for genuine freedom. He pushed for economic policies that would enable formerly enslaved people to purchase land, knowing that economic independence was crucial for escaping the cycle of debt and exploitation that threatened to recreate slavery's power dynamics through new mechanisms. He fought against racial discrimination in public accommodations and legal proceedings, challenging the white supremacist customs that persisted despite their formal prohibition under Reconstruction laws. In 1810, Robert Smalls was elected to the United States House of Representatives, becoming one of the first black Americans to serve in Congress during Reconstruction. His election sent a powerful symbolic message about the possibilities that Reconstruction had created. A former slave was now legislating in the nation's capital, participating in debates about the country's future on equal terms with white representatives from across the United States. Robert would serve 5 terms in Congress over the next 15 years, advocating for civil rights, educational funding, and economic policies designed to support black advancement. But Robert's congressional career unfolded during a period when Reconstruction was being systematically dismantled by white Southerners who had never accepted racial equality and Northern politicians who were increasingly willing to abandon black Americans to white Southern control in exchange for political compromise. The 1876 presidential election's disputed outcome was resolved through the Compromise of 1877, which removed federal troops from the South and effectively ended federal enforcement of black civil rights. Without federal protection, Southern states began implementing Jim Crow laws that created legal racial segregation, disenfranchised black voters through literacy tests and poll taxes, and recreated racial hierarchy through mechanisms that technically complied with constitutional prohibitions against slavery while achieving similar practical outcomes. Robert Smalls experienced this betrayal directly. In 1877, he was falsely accused of corruption related to his work on a state printing contract. The charges were almost certainly politically motivated, designed to discredit a prominent black politician and discourage black political participation. Robert was convicted in a trial that featured an all-white jury, a white judge, and legal proceedings that violated basic fairness standards. He faced potential imprisonment until Governor Wade Hampton, ironically a former Confederate general, pardoned him after concluding that the conviction was unjust and politically motivated. This experience did not break Robert's determination to fight for black rights, but it illustrated the enormous obstacles that black political leaders faced as white supremacy reasserted control over Southern governments. Throughout the 1880s and 1890s, as Reconstruction's promise gave way to Jim Crow's oppression, Robert continued serving in Congress, advocating for legislation to protect black voting rights and civil liberties, even as these protections were systematically eroded across the South. One of Robert's most significant congressional achievements came in 1880 when he successfully advocated for the return of substantial prize money to the crew members who had escaped aboard the Planter in 1862. Under maritime law, captured enemy vessels and cargo could be sold, with proceeds distributed to those who performed the capture. The USS Onward had claimed the Planter as a prize and received compensation, but the enslaved crew members who actually captured the vessel had received nothing. Robert's congressional lobbying resulted in legislation that awarded him $1,500 and distributed additional compensation to his crew members, a financial recognition of their 1862 achievement that came 27 years late but provided meaningful economic benefit. Robert used his wartime reputation and congressional connections to acquire property in Beaufort, South Carolina, ultimately purchasing a substantial residence that had belonged to his former master's family. The symbolism was powerful. The man who had been born as property on this family's plantation now owned their home, had served his state and nation in positions of authority they had never imagined a black man could hold, and had raised children who received education and opportunities that would have been legally prohibited under slavery. Robert's life trajectory embodied Reconstruction's promise, even as that promise was being systematically destroyed around him. After losing his congressional seat in 1887 due to increasing white suppression of black voting, Robert continued his public service through other channels. He was appointed as customs collector for the Port of Beaufort, a federal position that provided steady income and enabled him to support educational and community initiatives. He became a major advocate for black education, using his resources and influence to support schools and educational programs that would provide black children with opportunities for advancement. Robert Smalls died on February 23, 1915, at age 75, in the Beaufort home that had once belonged to his former master's family. By then, the Jim Crow system had achieved nearly complete control over Southern society, creating legal racial segregation that would persist for another 50 years. The interracial democracy that Reconstruction had briefly created was dead, killed by white violence, legal maneuvering, and Northern indifference. Black Southerners lived under a racial regime that, while not identical to slavery, created severe legal and social oppression that denied them basic civil rights and economic opportunities. But Robert's life demonstrated that even within these constraints, individual courage and sustained resistance could achieve extraordinary outcomes. He had stolen himself and his family from slavery at immense personal risk. He had served his country with distinction during war. He had helped craft progressive legislation during Reconstruction. He had represented his district in Congress for multiple terms. He had used his position and resources to support Black education and community development. He had lived to see his children receive opportunities that would have been unthinkable during his enslaved childhood. The legacy of Robert Smalls extends beyond his personal achievements to symbolize the possibilities that briefly existed during Reconstruction and the tragedy of their destruction. His story demonstrates that Black Americans were fully capable of exercising political leadership, military command, and civic responsibility when given opportunity, destroying racist myths about Black intellectual inferiority that white supremacists use to justify oppression. His life trajectory from enslaved harbor pilot to Union Navy captain to United States Congressman illustrated the extraordinary transformations that were possible when legal barriers to Black advancement were removed. Yet Robert's story also reveals how fragile these gains were, how quickly they could be destroyed when white supremacy reasserted control, and how the promise of genuine racial equality remained unfulfilled despite extraordinary individual achievement. The interracial democracy that Robert helped build during Reconstruction was systematically dismantled, not through honest debate about policy, but through violence, fraud, and legal mechanisms specifically designed to circumvent constitutional protections for Black civil rights. Modern remembrance of Robert Smalls has been uneven. For many years after his death, his story was largely forgotten outside of South Carolina's Black communities, where oral traditions preserved memories that white-dominated historical narratives chose to ignore. The Civil War stories that American culture celebrated focused on white commanders and battles, overlooking the crucial contributions of Black Americans who fought for their own freedom. The Reconstruction era, when presented in mainstream American history, was often portrayed as a mistake, a period of excessive Black political power and white victimization, rather than as the unfulfilled promise of genuine multiracial democracy. In recent decades, historians have worked to correct these distortions, recovering Robert Smalls' story and placing it within the broader context of Black agency during and after slavery. His biography has been the subject of multiple books, articles, and documentary projects that emphasize his strategic brilliance, his courage, and his sustained commitment to Black advancement despite overwhelming obstacles. Schools have been named in his honor. Historical markers in Charleston and Beaufort commemorate his achievements, and there have been recurring calls for his story to receive the major Hollywood film treatment it clearly deserves, presenting his remarkable life to audiences who remain largely ignorant of this crucial chapter in American history. The theft of the Planter stands as one of the most audacious military actions in American history, a perfectly executed operation that required meticulous planning, exceptional courage, split-second decision-making under pressure, and the kind of strategic intelligence that professional military officers spent years cultivating. That this operation was planned and executed by a 23-year-old enslaved man, using knowledge he had acquired through careful observation while being treated as property, demonstrates the profound injustice and waste of the slavery system. How many other Robert Smalls existed under slavery? Their potential brilliance, crushed by a system that treated them as equipment rather than human beings. How much talent, creativity, and leadership ability was destroyed by the racist assumption that Black people were incapable of the intellectual and moral qualities that defined full humanity. These questions remain relevant because the racist assumptions that justified slavery did not disappear with slavery's formal abolition. They persisted through Jim Crow, through the massive resistance to civil rights, through ongoing systemic racism that continues to constrain Black advancement despite legal prohibitions against discrimination. Robert Small's story challenges these assumptions at their foundation by demonstrating that a Black man who received no formal education and lived under slavery's brutal constraints could nonetheless outthink, outplan, and outmaneuver the Confederate military establishment that claimed moral and intellectual superiority based on white supremacy. The story also reveals the crucial role that Black Americans played in securing their own freedom, contradicting the comfortable myth that slavery ended primarily through white Northern benevolence. The Union won the Civil War in significant part because Black Americans, both those who escaped slavery to fight for the Union and those who remained in the South, resisting Confederate authority and providing intelligence to Union forces, actively undermined the Confederate war effort. Robert Smalls was not a passive recipient of freedom granted by white liberators. He seized his freedom through his own courage and intelligence, then used that freedom to fight for Union victory and Black rights. His story exemplifies Black agency, the active resistance, strategic thinking, and sustained struggle that Black Americans employed to destroy slavery and build the foundations for genuine freedom. If there is a lesson that resonates across the decades from Robert Small's life to contemporary America, it is that systems of oppression are neither natural nor inevitable. They are maintained through specific mechanisms, laws, customs, violence, propaganda that can be studied, understood, and ultimately overcome through strategic resistance and organized action. Robert Smalls studied the slavery system with meticulous attention, identified its vulnerabilities, and exploited them with devastating effectiveness. He did not accept his enslaved status as natural or inevitable. He refused to believe that white supremacy's claims about Black inferiority were true. He prepared himself for the opportunity to escape, and when that opportunity arrived, he executed his plan with precision that professional military officers would have struggled to match. This combination of intellectual preparation, strategic patience, and decisive action, when opportunity arose, offers a template for resistance against injustice that extends far beyond Robert's specific historical moment. The specific tactics that Robert employed, studying his oppressors' systems, building trusted networks of fellow resistors, preparing meticulously for action, and executing with courage despite overwhelming risks, remain relevant for anyone confronting unjust power structures. His life demonstrates that individuals can make extraordinary difference through careful preparation and courageous action, even when facing systems that appear invincible. Robert Small's story also illustrates the profound importance of representation and historical memory. For too long, American historical narratives focused exclusively on white actors, presenting Black Americans as passive victims or background characters rather than as active agents who shaped their own destinies and influenced historical outcomes. This erasure of Black agency served to reinforce racist assumptions by denying evidence of Black leadership, courage, and competence. Recovering stories like Robert Small's challenges these distortions and provides crucial counter-narratives that demonstrate Black Americans' central role in the struggle for freedom. When young Black Americans learn about Robert Smalls, they encounter a figure who defies stereotypes and demonstrates possibilities that racist narratives deny. They see someone who looked like them achieving extraordinary success through intelligence, courage, and sustained effort, despite facing obstacles that white Americans never had to overcome. This representation matters profoundly for shaping how young people understand themselves and their potential. Similarly, when white Americans learn about Robert Smalls, they encounter evidence that challenges comfortable assumptions about history and forces confrontation with the reality that Black Americans have consistently demonstrated leadership and competence whenever given opportunity, making it impossible to justify ongoing racial inequalities through claims about inherent differences in capability. The story of the planter's theft resonates in our contemporary moment because it reminds us that what seems impossible can become achievable through careful planning and courageous action. In May 1862, the idea that 8 enslaved men could steal a Confederate warship, navigate it past 5 military forts, and deliver it to Union forces seemed absurdly unlikely. The power differential between enslaved people and their masters appeared insurmountable. The surveillance systems that enforced slavery seemed too thorough to overcome. The military checkpoints appeared too well defended to pass. Yet Robert Smalls and his crew succeeded because they understood that even overwhelming power structures contain vulnerabilities that can be exploited through careful observation, strategic planning, and decisive action. When opportunity arises, this lesson applies to contemporary struggles against injustice. Systems of oppression, whether based on race, economic inequality, gender discrimination, or other forms of structural violence, maintain power through mechanisms that appear natural and inevitable until someone demonstrates their vulnerabilities. Robert Smalls did not accept slavery as natural. He studied its mechanisms until he understood them well enough to destroy them for himself and those he loved. His example suggests that challenging injustice requires first refusing to accept its claims about inevitability, then methodically preparing for action, then executing with courage when circumstances permit. The human capacity for courage under extreme pressure remains one of history's most inspiring constants. Robert Smalls stood in that wheelhouse approaching Fort Sumter, knowing that discovery meant death, yet he maintained the composure necessary to perform a convincing impersonation of white authority. Hannah Smalls kept 3 children silent below deck, while Confederate artillery could have reduced them to nothing in seconds. The crew members operated the ship's complex machinery, while terror must have screamed through their minds. These were not superhuman individuals immune to fear. They were ordinary people who found extraordinary courage when circumstances demanded it. Their story reminds us that heroism is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear, when action serves a cause larger than personal safety. Every person aboard the planter that night understood the risks they faced. They chose freedom over safety, action over paralysis, hope over resignation. This choice, made collectively by people who trusted each other enough to stake their lives on shared commitment, demonstrates the power of solidarity and mutual support in confronting overwhelming odds. The practical intelligence that Robert demonstrated deserves particular recognition. He did not attempt dramatic action without thorough preparation. He spent months, possibly years, observing, learning, memorizing, preparing for a moment that might never come. When opportunity arrived, he was ready because he had done the mental work necessary to exploit it. This combination of patient preparation and decisive execution offers lessons for anyone working toward ambitious goals against significant obstacles. Success rarely comes from spontaneous inspiration alone. It emerges from sustained effort, careful planning, and the discipline to prepare thoroughly, even when success seems unlikely. Robert's post-escape career demonstrates that surviving a dramatic escape was only the beginning of his contribution. He could have accepted freedom and lived quietly, grateful to have escaped slavery's violence. Instead, he committed himself to fighting for Union victory, serving in dangerous combat roles, and then dedicating decades to political work, advancing Black rights. His sustained commitment to collective liberation rather than individual comfort illustrates the difference between personal freedom and collective justice. Robert understood that his family's escape meant little if millions remained enslaved, that his political success meant little if most Black Americans remained disenfranchised and oppressed. This broader vision, the understanding that individual achievement within an unjust system is insufficient without fighting to dismantle that system, distinguishes Robert Smalls from those who achieve personal success and then ignore ongoing injustice. His political career during and after Reconstruction focused consistently on policies that would benefit Black Americans collectively: education funding, voting rights protection, economic opportunity, legal equality. He used his position to fight for systemic change rather than simply enjoying the privileges his status afforded him. The betrayal of Reconstruction, the abandonment of Black Americans to white supremacist control after 1877, adds tragic dimension to Robert's story. He lived to see the interracial democracy he had fought to build systematically destroyed. The vision of racial equality that Reconstruction briefly embodied was crushed by white violence, legal manipulation, and Northern indifference. By the time Robert died in 1915, the Jim Crow system had recreated racial hierarchy nearly as oppressive as slavery itself, denying Black Southerners basic civil rights and economic opportunities through mechanisms that technically complied with constitutional protections while achieving similar practical outcomes. Yet even this tragedy does not diminish Robert's achievements. He demonstrated what was possible when legal barriers to Black advancement were removed. He proved that Black Americans could exercise military leadership, political authority, and civic responsibility at the highest levels. He created a record of achievement that destroyed racist myths about Black inferiority, providing ammunition for future civil rights activists who would point to figures like Robert Smalls as proof that racial inequality was product of oppression rather than any inherent differences in capability. His story has been recovered and celebrated in recent years as historians work to correct the distortions that long characterized American historical narratives about slavery and Reconstruction. Robert Smalls appears in books, documentaries, educational materials, and public commemorations that present his remarkable life to audiences who deserve to know about his contributions. In 2023, the United States Navy renamed the USS Chancellorsville, previously named for a Confederate military victory, as the USS Robert Smalls, recognizing that American military heroes should include the enslaved man who stole a Confederate warship and served his country with distinction rather than the Confederate forces who fought to preserve slavery. This act of renaming represents broader shifts in how American culture engages with difficult histories. For too long, Confederate symbols were honored through monuments, military base names, and official recognition that treated the Confederacy's defense of slavery as a legitimate cause worthy of respect. The gradual removal of these symbols and their replacement with commemorations of those who fought for freedom represents long overdue acknowledgement that historical memory shapes contemporary values, and that celebrating those who fought for slavery sends destructive messages about whose contributions deserve honor. Robert Smalls deserves this recognition not simply because he performed a dramatic escape, but because his entire life trajectory embodied the struggle for freedom and equality that defined America's most consequential moral conflict. From his birth into slavery, through his self-emancipation, military service, political career, and sustained advocacy for Black rights, Robert's life was dedicated to challenging and destroying systems of racial oppression. His story is fundamentally American, not despite his enslavement and race, but because his fight for freedom represents the nation's most important and ongoing struggle. The theft of the Planter occurred over a few hours in May 1862, but its significance extends far beyond that single night. It demonstrated Black agency and competence at a moment when such demonstrations helped shift Northern opinion about Black capabilities and rights. It provided crucial military intelligence that aided Union operations. It established Robert as a figure whose authority and expertise would shape Reconstruction politics. And it created a narrative of courage, intelligence, and resistance that has inspired subsequent generations working toward justice. When we tell Robert Smalls' story today, we honor not just one man's achievement, but the millions of enslaved Americans who resisted bondage through countless acts of courage and defiance. We acknowledge the Black agency that was crucial to slavery's destruction. We recognize the leadership and competence that Black Americans demonstrated whenever given opportunity. And we commit ourselves to completing the work that Robert and his generation began. The work of building a society where all people enjoy genuine freedom, equality, and opportunity regardless of race. This work remains unfinished. The systems of racial oppression that replaced slavery after Reconstruction's betrayal have evolved but not disappeared. Contemporary racial inequalities in wealth, education, criminal justice, health care, and political representation reflect historical injustices that were never adequately addressed or remedied. Robert Smalls fought his entire life against these inequalities. His story challenges us to match his courage, his strategic intelligence, and his sustained commitment to justice. On that dark morning in May 1862, Robert Smalls stood at the planter's wheel and chose to risk everything for freedom. He succeeded not through luck or superhuman abilities, but through meticulous preparation, careful observation, strategic thinking, and courage when circumstances demanded it. His escape marked the beginning of a life dedicated to fighting for collective liberation rather than individual comfort. His achievements demonstrated capabilities that white supremacy insisted Black Americans lacked. His legacy challenges contemporary Americans to examine our own systems of injustice and consider what courage, preparation, and sustained action might be required to overcome them. The story of Robert Smalls and the USS Planter is not simply history. It is a continuing call to action, a demonstration that what seems impossible can be achieved through intelligence and courage, and a reminder that the struggle for freedom requires not just dramatic moments, but sustained commitment across entire lifetimes. This is the story of a man who refused to accept the injustice that surrounded him, who prepared himself for freedom, who seized that freedom with perfect execution, and who spent the remainder of his life fighting so that others might enjoy the liberty he had claimed. This is American history at its most inspiring and most challenging, a record of both the terrible injustice that slavery represented and the extraordinary resistance that ultimately destroyed it.